Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Malik Stewart and I'm the Director of Multicultural Student Services at College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Thank you for joining us on Martin Luther King Jr. Day as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King with events today and throughout the week. This afternoon's event features a wellness presentation titled Rest as Revolution in the Age of Racial Reckoning from Dr. Reba Peoples. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land we sit on today. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory, whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. I'd like to take a moment to thank members of the MLK Planning Committee for their time, inspiration, and work in helping to plan this year's events. I'm also grateful for the audience and taking this time to be in community as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King. The theme for this year's MLK Week at St. Ben's and St. John's is the fierce urgency of now, a phrase Dr. King used in two prominent speeches, one being his famous I Have a Dream speech, and the other in his Beyond Vietnam sermon of April 1967, given at Riverside Church in New York City. Quoting from his Beyond Vietnam sermon, Dr. King said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at the flood. It ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. Powerful words spoken 55 years ago and just as relevant today. I hope that you keep these words and that phrase, the fierce urgency of now, in mind as you engage with this week's events. Now, I'm excited today to welcome Dr. Reba Peoples to our community. Dr. Peoples is joining us from Atlanta, thanks to Zoom, but spent many years in the Twin Cities. Dr. Peoples is a board-certified psychiatrist and founder of Imara Health and Wellness. She is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio and obtained her psychiatric residency training in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I encourage the audience today to use the Q&A function for questions, and we'll be sure to save some time at the end for Dr. Peoples to respond. You will want a pen and paper or something to take notes with for this session. I repeat, you will want a pen and paper to take notes for this session. Without further ado, Dr. Reba Peoples.
Thank you so much for having me. In preparing for today's discussion, I've been thinking a lot about Dr. King and his words and his legacy, and I'm particularly moved by a passage from that 1967 speech to Riverside Church, where he states that a time comes when silence is betrayal. Now, of course, Dr. King was speaking out against the war in Vietnam, but he was also offering a scathing commentary on the evils of racism, inequality, and economic oppression. The solution that he offers is a radical revolution of values. He states, quote, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, end quote. So how do we go about this grand undertaking of a radical revolution of values? I believe that it begins with creating a culture of wellness that truly honors our humanity. What most people don't realize is that we need to understand the social, historical, and biological context of what it means to be well in our society in order to understand how some of the ways that we navigate through the world are actually making us ill. We see this manifested in things like hustle culture that encourages a rise and grind philosophy that discourages sleep and encourages an always on, always accessible lifestyle. We also see this in the opposite extreme through the cult of toxic positivity that encourages self-care purely through a lens of personal resilience and gratitude alone, while completely ignoring the larger cultural and systemic factors that directly contribute to things like burnout and dissatisfaction. For members of groups who have historically been denied equal access to power and opportunity, we must also understand the social, historical, and biological context of oppression and inequality in order to understand how to overcome it. And this is equally important for our co-conspirators who are committed to creating a just and fair society that works equally well for all of us. Now, in addition to my clinical practice as a psychiatrist, I'm also a wellness coach and an emotional liberation strategist. So I specialize in helping high achievers learn to let go of the programs, patterns, and behaviors that no longer serve our growth or well-being so that we can live lives with more meaning, purpose, and impact. Now, emotional liberation means different things to different people, but ultimately it means being able to navigate the world in a way that's in alignment with our highest values. It means being able to step into the role of being architects of our own lives and masters of our own destiny. It means daring to thrive in spite of every external circumstance telling us that we shouldn't. It also means choosing to love ourselves, even when the world doesn't love us back. As people of African descent, we navigate a complex and unique set of challenges, both in and out of the classroom and the workplace. And many of these challenges are often born out of a mismatch between one's personal ideology, ethos, and worldview, and those of American society at large. So we'll start our discussion by defining culture, and then we'll explore some of the ways that cultural mismatch can show up in our day-to-day lives. And we'll end with a smart wellness framework for navigating wellness in spite of the system, structures, and cultural norms that may stand in the way of us loving all of who we are, living fearlessly and authentically, and being able to cultivate internal calm, even in the midst of external chaos. Now, before I share my screen, I'd like you to take a moment to set your intentions as we enter this time together. What do you need to temporarily let go of in order to be fully present today? Does that look like silencing your phone or closing out any open tabs on your browser? It may look like cozying up with a big warm blanket or a warm cup of tea. It may look like lighting a candle. Ask yourself what you need right now and honor what your spirit is telling you. So deep-rooted transformation doesn't happen without self-reflection. So I'm going to ask you all a few journal questions, and hopefully you have something to write with nearby. And if you don't have something to write with, I still invite you to silently ponder these questions, even if you aren't physically writing them down. So the first question is, how do you view yourself? How do you view yourself? Now, this could be aspects of your identity, could be character traits, beliefs that you hold deeply, whatever you feel makes you, you. And we'll spend just a few moments for you to jot those down. Now, the second question is, how do other people view you? How do other people view you? So what do other people see when they behold the majesty that is you? We'll take a few moments to jot down those responses as well. The third question, and this is two parts, is there a mismatch between how you view yourself and how other people perceive you? Why or why not? So is there a mismatch between how you view yourself and how other people perceive you? Why or why not? And lastly, where do you feel most comfortable and why? Where do you feel most comfortable and why? So this self-reflection is going to be important as we move through our discussion. So we're talking about a radical revolution of values. And that revolution begins with creating a culture of wellness that truly values our humanity. And if we want to create a culture of wellness, it's probably a good idea to define culture. So according to the American Sociological Association, culture has to do with the languages, customs, beliefs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories developed by members of all social groups that make their social environments meaningful. So culture gives us meaning. Second definition is culture as a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes members of one group or category of people from another. And yet a third definition by Dr. Waite Nobles is that culture is a process that gives people a general design for living and patterns for interpreting their reality. So culture essentially helps us make sense of the world. There are different aspects of culture. So ideology, the system of ideas and ideals, ethos, so the characteristic spirit of a culture, and worldview, so the philosophy of life or the conception of the world. And culture shows up in our behavior, our values, our attitudes. So to cultivate a lifestyle that's truly in alignment with physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, we have to understand that one's lifestyle is often a reflection of underlying cultural values. So when you think about what it means to be an American, what comes to mind? Are there any core American cultural values that you can think of? And I'd like you to jot those down in your journal. Now, if you were born and raised in the United States, it's probably something that you may not have given much attention to unless you've traveled abroad. And if you're new to the United States, or if you have parents who have immigrated, you're likely much more aware of American culture and American cultural values, especially when those cultural differences may be different than those of your parents. Now, there's an American sociologist, Ruth Hill Useem, who coined the term third culture to describe the experience of children of immigrants who spent a significant portion of their formative years outside of their parents' culture. So they tend to mix and match aspects of their birth culture with American culture to create a unique culture of their own, so a third culture. And many of these children describe a sense of being in a cultural limbo. So they're too American to truly feel at home in their birth country or their countries of origin, and too foreign to truly feel at home in the United States. So they often feel the need to wear many different masks, so omitting parts of themselves or their story to make their identity more palatable for others. And this feeling of being rootless and out of place, both in their ancestral home and in the United States, is often prevalent even when they were born and raised in the United States. Now, for those of us who are descendants of enslaved Africans, our enslaved ancestors found themselves forcibly immersed into a culture whose ideology, values, and worldview were in opposition to their traditional ways of being. So navigating this cultural mismatch really necessitated creation of a new culture and identity that kind of simultaneously allowed them to function in the strange new world of America, while covertly finding ways to preserve their traditional values. So many of those vestiges of culture still persist today. So for the descendants of enslaved Africans who have managed to retain many of the core vestiges of the traditional African value system of their ancestors, navigating the tightrope of conflicting cultural values can be mentally and spiritually exhausting. So much like the third culture kids described by Ruth Hill Useem, American descendants of enslaved Africans can sometimes find themselves feeling like strangers in a strange land. So in thinking of what you consider to be core American values, are there any of those values that are different than your own personal values or the values in your family? And does that cause any challenges? A lot of people aren't consciously aware of their cultural values. So there's a joke where two fish are swimming along in the ocean and they're greeted by another fish who says, hey, how's the water? And the fish turns to his friend and says, what the hell is water? So we're often oblivious to what surrounds us because it's so familiar that it's really the only thing that we know. So in 1984, Robert Coles of the Washington International Center set out to make the invisible aspects of American culture visible by publishing an article entitled "The Values That Americans Live By." So it was aimed at helping diplomats, so foreign diplomats to the United States, understand and assimilate into American culture more effectively. So his research led him to identify 13 core values that the majority of Americans hold true. And these underlying cultural values are manifested in our ideology, our ethos, our worldview, and often dictate our attitudes and behaviors. So many of the values that Americans often view as universal really are in sharp contrast to the values commonly held by individuals from non-Western societies. So we can see a lot of internal conflict when there's a mismatch between our own values and the values that society tells us that we should hold true. When those societal values don't align with our own personal understanding of the world. So, these are the 13 values, and bear in mind, these are ideal values, so they don't always necessarily play out in real life. And it's also possible to hold two contradictory values in one's mind simultaneously and accept both of them. Now, this comes at a cost because our brains, they prefer consistency. So we often compartmentalize as a way to avoid the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. So we may operate in one way in certain contexts while behaving completely differently in others. Rationalization and denial can be other ways that we try to cope with cognitive dissonance. Now, for the sake of time, we won't go through all of the values individually, but we'll point out a few along with the corresponding values that may be in contrast. Now, none of this is intended as a value judgment. These are just some of the different ways that people order their lives and make sense of the world around them. So you may find yourself in alignment with a lot of these values, while others may differ from your own personal view of the world. And as we're going through these, I invite you to think about how some of these core values may influence how you approach wellness, especially when your own personal core values may be in opposition to societal values at large. So a first, major American value is the idea of personal control over the environment. Now, this is in contrast with the value of being in harmony with nature. So in the United States, people consider it, normal and right that human beings, exploit nature. And many cultures consider it unwise and arrogant to assume that one could, even begin to think that they can dominate nature. So exploitation of nature disrupts the order and balance that are necessary to maintain harmony in the world. So if we think about the Dakota Access Pipeline, this is a major example of conflicting cultural values. So energy transfer partners believing that they have the right to exploit the environment to serve their own interests in order to create jobs and to fuel the economy, while members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe know that regardless of whatever economic incentive this pipeline may bring to the region, an oil spill would permanently contaminate the Missouri River, which is a major water source for the millions of people living downstream. So for them, the health of the environment trumps the health of the economy. Now, a second value that can sometimes be in conflict is this idea of change being good versus the importance of stability and tradition. Now, this one seems to be selectively adhered to by a lot of Americans. So on the one hand, we tend to value progress, but I think that Americans also have a tendency to fiercely protect the status quo. So if we think about the current racial reckoning, it's suddenly become very fashionable for corporations to virtue signal solidarity. So they may, black out their Instagram pages or hashtag, Black Lives Matter, often without making, substantive changes with regard to things like income equality, board seats, representation and leadership, et cetera. Another contrasting value is the idea of control over time versus human interaction. So when we think about the Western concept of time, it's linear. So there's a past, a present, and future. So for many Americans, future-oriented concepts of time can really make it difficult for us to be fully present in the moment because we're constantly looking ahead. So for many cultures, the concept of time is viewed in 2 dimensions rather than 3. So according to Kenyan philosopher and theologian John Mbidi, time is understood as a series of events that have either occurred, so past, or are occurring, present. So the idea of a future is somewhat foreign. So there are some East African languages that don't have a word to describe the concept of future. So when time is experiential, relationships, communication, and ensuring needs are met take priority over keeping a schedule. So this can be frustrating if we have Western cultural values that really privilege the idea of time being money. So what's sometimes degradingly referred to as CP time is often a manifestation of this concept in action. So before I understood this, I would get really frustrated if I went to an event that had a lot of, what I thought to be unnecessary fluff before, getting to the point and, starting the program. But pre-program, fluff of things like centering or libation or personal introductions or, invoking ancestors. These are important and necessary rituals for building trust and showing respect for and recognizing the shared humanity of all individuals present in the space. So in the African worldview, it's preferable to cultivate relational rather than transactional exchanges with others. So rather than time being viewed as a commodity, time is viewed as something that enables connection. Another value that often we can see conflict around is this idea of individualism versus collectivism. So Western values strongly emphasize independence and being self-contained. So because of this, individual success is often prioritized over success of the group as a whole. Many cultures, on the other hand, really emphasize collectivism. So group success is considered more important than individual success. So someone from a culture who, that values collectivism may be more modest about their achievements or may publicly underestimate their abilities to not, appear arrogant. So this cultural value can unfortunately backfire in American work settings that reward self-promotion, since people who are more modest tend to be overlooked in favor of people who are a bit more vocal about their abilities. When we think about, competition, that's another, core American value. So this pressure to, be the best begins as early as kindergarten, and in some affluent communities, even as early as preschool. And, competition can lead to increases in self-esteem, provided you're winning, but it can also lead to significant feelings of unworthiness and self-criticism in non-winners. And because there are always more non-winners than winners when competing for what are thought to be scarce resources, competition really leaves a lot of people feeling worse about themselves. So these feelings of low self-esteem can carry over into adulthood, can manifest in things like anxiety, depression, perfectionism, emotional health concerns. So even when winning, constant comparisons to others may cause people to doubt the legitimacy of their success. Now, with the idea, and we touched on this a little bit previously, but the idea of a future orientation versus a past orientation is also an area of potential mismatch. And I'm going to quote directly from the paper. So Cole states that Americans place so much value on the future that they devalue the past and are to a large extent unconscious of the present. So even a happy present goes largely unnoticed because, happy as it may be, Americans have traditionally been hopeful that the future would bring even greater happiness. Almost all energy is directed toward realizing that better future. At best, the present condition is seen as preparatory to a later and greater event, which will eventually culminate in something even more worthwhile. So how many of us have been so preoccupied with reaching our destination that we've forgotten to enjoy the journey? Now, another big contrasting value that really influences wellness is this idea of an action work orientation. So this is in contrast to being. So most Americans really consider action to be superior to inaction. So we schedule super busy days, relaxation is planned and time limited. And the goal of relaxation is to be able to recharge enough so that we can work even harder once the relaxation is over. So being idle is frowned upon and almost considered sinful. And Americans often define themselves by their work. So one of the first questions if you're meeting a new person typically isn't, how are you? What brings you joy? It's usually, what do you do for a living? So the orientation toward working hard can sometimes lead to an unwillingness to acknowledge when one's body has been pushed beyond capacity. So pushing forward, even when rest is clearly needed, is sometimes viewed as a badge of honor, while taking a break or seeking help is sometimes viewed as a sign of laziness or weakness. So daring to care for oneself can be met with intense guilt and even shame. So Sherman James has written extensively about the concept of John Henryism. So for those who aren't familiar, John Henry was a steel driving man. So according to legend, he participated in a competition against a new mechanical steam-powered drill. And although he rallied the physical strength needed to defeat the machine and win the competition, he died soon after from exhaustion. So if we're not careful, that action work orientation can push us beyond our limits. Now, another conflicting value is this idea of directness and openness versus indirectness or saving face. I think this one depends on the part of the country that you're in. So having lived outside of Minnesota, I would have to say that Minnesotans tend to be a bit less direct in their communication styles. But direct communication with someone who values an indirect communication style can be interpreted as an attack rather than a communication. And conversely, communicating in an indirect way with someone who values direct communication is likely to be interpreted as insincere or backstabbing. So the direct communicator feels, how can I trust someone who says one thing to my face and does something different behind my back? Now, another conflicting value is the idea of materialism and acquisitiveness versus spiritualism and detachment. So if we examine the pre-colonial African cultural values that were commonly held by our ancestors in West Africa, there are several significant contrasts between the African worldview of the time and that of their European captors. And one major source of cultural mismatch is regarding the fundamental nature of reality. So the European Enlightenment of the 17th through 19th centuries really ushered in ideas that centered reason and empiricism. So the idea that knowledge is derived primarily from sensory experience. So if you can't, see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, measure it, it isn't a valid source of knowledge. So scholars of the Enlightenment era held the belief that the mind, consciousness, cognition, and intelligence are physical processes that can be explained through scientific investigation of the material world. Now, the African spiritual worldview, however, believed that the nature of existence extends far beyond what we can perceive with our physical senses. So our African ancestors believed that a spiritual realm exists alongside the physical realm. They also believed that what happens in one realm can impact the other and vice versa. So because these realms are in constant interchange with each other, there's effectively no separation between spirit and matter. So because spirit and matter are intertwined, it's possible to have a direct experience of the divine. So this is evident in ritual where individuals abandon themselves to rhythms, chants, drums, entering into states of ecstasy or trance. And derivatives of those ritualized expressions were evident in praise houses and ring shouts of the antebellum Black religious communities of the South, and preserved even in modern day Holy Ghost dances in the modern Black church. So these rituals point to a direct and personal experience of the divine. So rather than the externalization of power, which is often observed in materialist cultures, power is often recognized in the form of esteem or respect by privilege of birthright, age, special knowledge, or wisdom, rather than forced dominance or control. So if one is lacking the internal sense of power, right, that comes from recognition of oneness with the divine, then the sense of power can only be experienced in relation to others. So power over others in the form of dominance or control, or control of resources, becomes a central aspect of the ethos of materialist cultures. So we have a pop quiz. what are the two related items? And if you're not viewing the screen, the three items are a bus, a train, and train tracks. So what are the two related items? And this is an interesting test because our social orientation actually impacts how we categorize information and how we solve problems. So people in more collectivist societies tend to be more holistic in the way that they think about problems. So they focus more on the relationships and the context of the situation, while people in individualistic societies tend to focus more on separate elements. So Western thinkers will usually say train and bus because both are types of vehicle. Holistic thinkers, on the other hand, would say train and track because they're focused on the functional relationship between the two objects. So if this were a standard test of intelligence, the holistic thinker would score lower if the right answer was constructed from a Western framework or perspective. So we have to keep that in mind when we think about what gets rewarded and the ways of being that are valued in a society. I'm going to share a quote from a Rwandan individual who shared their thoughts about Western mental health workers who came to provide help after the genocide. They state, quote, "We had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers who came here immediately after the genocide, and we had to ask some of them to leave. They came and their practice did not involve being outside in the sun where you begin to feel better. There was no music or drumming to get your blood flowing again. There was no sense that everyone had taken the day off so that the entire community could come together to try to lift you up and bring you back to joy. There was no acknowledgement of the depression as something invasive and external that could actually be cast out again. Instead, they would take people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and have them sit around for an hour or so and talk about all the bad things that had happened to them. We had to ask them to leave." So imposing values by assuming cultural congruence can sometimes cause harm, and cultural mismatch tends to have the biggest impact on people who occupy less privileged positions in systems and structures. So individual achievement tends to be positively influenced by a perceived cultural fit between the individual and the values of the system that the individual operates within. So the onus is generally placed on the person with less power to learn to adapt to the dominant cultural norms, to gain acceptance and to succeed in that culture. So that can cause a lot of distress for individuals who navigate through structures that are informed by underlying values that may be different than their own. So although individuals from traditionally underrepresented groups may have a very solid sense of their cultural identity, they also recognize that in certain environments, there are inherent risks in bringing their full selves to work. So individuals who feel pressured to make sure that their language, their behavior, their appearance fits with their company's cultural norms may struggle with where to draw the line with regard to how much of themselves they're willing to compromise. So in spite of efforts to blend in, they may still find themselves in a position of being invisible yet hypervisible at the same time. And this can be problematic because rather than being free to focus on the work at hand, people who work in environments or have to function in environments that aren't psychologically safe for them to be themselves are often preoccupied, so with fears of not being taken seriously if they're unable to live up to self-imposed perfectionistic ideals. And those fears can stifle creativity. It can limit willingness to take risks. And those fears aren't completely irrational. We know that things like confirmation bias can ensure that non-privileged people aren't afforded the same room for grace as their privileged counterparts when they make mistakes. So rather than offering up new or innovative ideas, individuals may tone down their suggestions in favor of safer options because they know too well that their mistakes may not be viewed as opportunities for growth, but as proof of incompetence. So anxiety and perfectionism can become frequent struggles because minoritized individuals don't always get to enjoy the assumption of competence that other people may take for granted. And things like discrimination and microaggressions can take a toll on our health. So numerous studies have shown that people who experience discrimination tend to have worse health outcomes and are more likely to have elevated stress hormones, increased inflammation, high blood pressure, cognitive impairments, poor sleep. And a lot of this work has been done by people like David R. Williams or Arlene Geronimus. She actually coined a term called weathering to describe the accelerated aging that happens as a direct result of chronic stress. So Black women age an average of 6 years faster than white women, kind of metabolically. So prioritizing wellness really is a matter of life and death, particularly for BIPOC communities. So creating a wellness, a culture of wellness, starts with viewing wellness as a lifestyle. And it isn't an end point or a final destination. It's really transforming your health one decision at a time. It's deliberately choosing to value your humanity every single day. And that is the fierce urgency of now. Audre Lorde reminds us that the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. So smart wellness is a framework for creating a lifestyle that supports emotional well-being, while also holding space to challenge the systems and structures that stand in the way of creating a fair and just society that works equally well for all of us. So SMART is an acronym, and each letter of the acronym represents a modifiable lifestyle factor that influences wellness. So we'll quickly go through these and then get into Q&A. So S is sleep. There is a documented sleep gap between white people and Black people. Black people are more likely to have what's termed very short sleep, so less than 5 hours nightly, which is significantly less than the recommended 7 to 9 hours. A shorter sleep duration has been linked to hypertension, so high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, as well as weakened immune health. So as a result, a shorter sleep duration is also linked to higher mortality. So it's incredibly important that we do everything we can to prioritize getting enough restful, restorative sleep. So we want to aim for 7 to 9 hours nightly. We also want to maintain a routine. So a lot of us fall into a habit of sleeping only a few hours during the week and then trying to make up the time during the weekend. But that's something that you don't want to do because it really wreaks havoc on your body's internal clock. So we all have an internal hormonal rhythm called the circadian rhythm. And that governs when we feel awake and energized and when we're ready to rest. So if you want to maintain that hormonal balance, you have to maintain a consistent routine. So ideally, if you can, try to fall asleep around the same time each night and try to wake up around the same time each morning. That would be ideal. It's also important to be aware of blue light exposure. So the blue light that's emitted from electronic devices actually kind of tricks our retina into thinking that it's still daylight. That can suppress melatonin production, and melatonin is an important hormone that lets our bodies know that it's time to wind down and rest. So this is why you have the night mode on your devices. So it's important that that's enabled when you're using your devices after dark. You can even invest in things like blue light blocking glasses to use when you are on your devices as well. And speaking of devices, you want to power them down, an hour or two before bedtime, ideally. And this gives yourself a chance to mentally unplug before bedtime. So that would be a great time to do, meditation or journaling. And we often think of starting our day in the morning, but we actually start our day the evening before. So if you go to bed feeling restless or unsettled, you're more likely to start the next morning feeling the same way. So you really want to create an evening routine that helps you get calm and settled before bedtime. You also want to make sure that you use the bed only for sleeping. So avoiding the urge to watch television in bed or do homework in bed. You really want to create a mental association that views the bed as a place to rest. It's also important to create a restful environment when you're sleeping. So this means blocking out artificial light sources. If you have a lot of devices in your room that are sort of blinking or glowing, even when the lights are off, that can make it difficult to get good quality sleep. So if that is the case, thinking about buying kind of shades to go over your eyes to darken things can be helpful. So an eye mask to sleep with. Thinking about blackout curtains if you live in a city that has a lot of light pollution. Blood sugar balance is also important. I don't think we tend to think about this, but blood sugar dips at night can disrupt your sleep. So you want to make sure that you're eating enough protein with the first meal of the day. And this helps stabilize your blood sugar throughout the day. It's also important to eat good quality fats and fiber as well. Caffeine, avoiding caffeine too late in the day or other stimulants is also important. Avoiding strenuous exercise before bed. Intense workouts actually boost cortisol, and cortisol can cause us to feel awake and alert rather than sleepy and ready to rest once it's our bedtime. So those are some simple tweaks that can really make a world of difference in helping you get more restful sleep at night. So in your journals, if you can write down, one thing that you plan to do to kind of step up your sleep hygiene game, that would be helpful. Now, the next letter in the acronym is M, so movement. By now, it will come as no surprise that notions of fitness are often a reflection of culture and the prevailing cultural norms of the time. And you can test this out by yourself, for yourself, by conducting a quick Google search of the term fit body. So this is what my search pulls up. Is there anything that you notice about the images? And what I see are able-bodied individuals, lots of lean muscle mass. They're very young, likely under 30 or so. Their gender expressions all fit into conventional male-female gender binaries. There are very few people of color. So it's interesting to note that fitness, or at least according to Google, seems to have little to do with overall health and a lot to do with physical appearance, namely thin bodies with lots of lean muscle mass. So this wasn't always the case. Remember, notions of fitness tend to shift with prevailing social and cultural norms of the time. So, if you think of people like Peter Paul Rubens, for example, so he was an artist that really idealized a curvaceous body type as the archetype of beauty, health, and sensuality. And things started shifting in the early 19th century, and colonialism was partially responsible for this trend. Now, if you want to read more about this, there is a book by Sabrina Strings called Fearing the Black Body, and she breaks this down into a lot of detail. But essentially, French colonizers in particular began to popularize stereotypes of Africans and Black people as being gluttonous, overweight, and incapable of showing restraint around food. So over time, larger body types became synonymous with being lazy and immoral. So when we think about health access, there are deep ties between fitness, race, and racism. Predominantly Black populated areas are less likely to have a gym. Marginalized income areas are 4.5 times less likely to have access to a recreational facility. 94% of the nation's majority African-American counties are food insecure. And health access is particularly important during the age of COVID-19. So we know that factors related to metabolic health directly impact susceptibility to severe disease and death. So it's incredibly important to strive to be metabolically healthy during these times, in addition to vaccination. So it's estimated that only 1 in 8 Americans are metabolically healthy, and metabolic health isn't synonymous with being thin. So 20 to 40% of people with what is considered a healthy body mass index, so BMI, are metabolically unhealthy. So the technical term is metabolically obese with normal weight, or sarcopenic obesity, meaning that there's relatively low muscle mass with relatively high percentages of body fat, so skinny fat. So there's really no such thing as a healthy weight, only healthy people. So there are a few metabolic markers that we want to be aware of at a bare minimum. And even as young people, you need to know these numbers. Poor metabolic health isn't just an old people problem. So the 5 markers that really dictate if someone has metabolic syndrome are blood pressure. So anything above 130 over 85 really puts you in a danger zone. Waist circumference. Anything above 40 inches for men, 35 inches for women, is associated with higher levels of visceral fat, so fat surrounding your internal organs. And that can be a marker for poor metabolic health outcomes. Triglyceride levels, so anything above 150 puts you at risk for metabolic syndrome. HDL, so the good cholesterol, anything less than 40 micrograms per deciliter for men or less than 50 for women, places you at higher risk. And then blood sugar balance. So any blood sugar above 100 in fasting state does place you at risk. And an even better marker is something called a hemoglobin A1c. So this gives us an idea about trends in your blood sugar over the past 90 days. So 1 or more of those factors places you at higher metabolic risk, and 3 or more of those markers indicates full-blown metabolic syndrome. So rather than focusing on the number on a scale, it's really important that we're focused on our metabolic numbers. Now, the A in the acronym is awareness, and that's an important tool that really helps us learn how to cultivate calm, even in the midst of chaos. So awareness, particularly mindful awareness, really enables us to reconnect with our humanity. So these are very challenging times that we're living in, and many of us are dealing with feelings of stress and overwhelm. And although some degree of stress is an unavoidable aspect of navigating life in the modern world, chronic stress is toxic to our well-being. And fortunately, there are tools that can help shield us from the impact of the toxic stress that we navigate daily. So awareness essentially is a state of being conscious of internal and external events and experiences. So it's thought that awareness is really, or at least self-awareness, is what separates humans from animals. Now, mindfulness is bringing attention to whatever is happening in the present moment from a stance of curiosity and non-judgment. So essentially awareness without judgment. And then we have meditation. And meditation is a technique for resting the mind and really attaining a state of consciousness that's different from the normal waking state. So I think a lot of times people tend to think of meditation as sitting perfectly still in lotus posture, chanting Om, but there are many ways to meditate. So it can look like seated meditation, but it can also look like moving forms of meditation like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong. Sound can be meditative. So things like toning or gongs or mantras can be ways to enter into different states of consciousness. And when we are in those altered states, there are measurable changes in brainwave activity. And the benefit of meditation is that it promotes something called neuroplasticity. So that's the ability of the nervous system to reorganize its structure, function, and connections in response to internal or external stimuli. So mindfulness and meditation are associated with improved attention. It can be associated with decreased reactivity, decreased depression by modulating inflammatory pathways, and it can promote relaxation by increasing parasympathetic tone. Now, the R in the acronym is recognition of identity. So in other words, it's important to know who you are outside of the titles that you've earned or what you do for a living. So this involves honest self-reflection and getting clear about your values. So we often internalize messages that we aren't good enough. So it's important to not only celebrate yourself, but seek out spaces where you're celebrated. There's a famous quote that there's no competition in destiny. So when you know who you are, no one can make you feel less than. And then the final letter in our acronym is tailoring inputs. So, how are we feeding ourselves? And we have to be as careful about how we choose to feed our minds and our spirits as we are about how we choose to feed our physical bodies. Now, although many of us are aware of the critical role that the food that we eat can have on the way that we feel, many of us don't know that what we put on our bodies is also really important, maybe as important as what we put into our bodies. So, many of the chemicals that are present as additives in things like makeup and personal care products, household cleaners, can have the potential to act as toxins in our bodies. They can act as endocrine disruptors that can negatively impact our hormones, or even increase the risk of things like certain cancers. So we do have to make a conscientious effort to purchase safe, non-toxic products that preserve our health and well-being. Now, in terms of mental health, it's important to not overlook the influence of media, particularly social media, on emotional health. Marketers do have an incentive to exploit our insecurities and profit from our fears. So repeatedly exposing our minds to messages and images that kind of trigger the stress response or trigger feeling less than can have a negative impact on our physical and emotional health. Now, excessive consumption of media is associated with lower creativity, lowered capacity for reflection, lowered capacity for critical thinking and analysis. So we have to make a commitment to monitor and set limits on media inputs that may damage our cognitive or emotional health. And lastly, it's important to think about, how we're surrounding ourselves. So, surrounding ourselves with people who have our best interests in mind. So people who speak life into us and are sources of hope, inspiration, and empowerment. So we'll close out our time together prior to shifting into the Q&A with a brief visualization. And this is a visualization whose aim is to help us get back into alignment with who we truly are. This is the true core of our being. Some may refer to this as our higher self or inner wisdom. You may be someone who works very hard, is very committed and passionate about your work or your studies, but in this season, you find yourself not feeling valued or appreciated. And often the sense of longing, needing comes when we've gotten out of alignment with who we truly are. When we've lost the supreme confidence in knowing the unique gifts that we alone can offer the world. When we're in this space, we often find ourselves seeking praise, encouragement, and validation from sources that are not capable of supplying what we need. And when that supply is lacking, we begin to doubt our own abilities. We begin to think that we're not good enough. So we find ourselves doing more, not from a place of joy and abundance, but from a place of longing and lack, hoping desperately to get the validation that we desire. And in seeking that validation, we find ourselves becoming someone that we are not, shifting, twisting, contorting, trying to fit ourselves into the narrow box of expectation that was never designed for us. Is it any wonder that we feel inadequate when we do not fit? So in this moment, I invite you to reflect on who you truly are. That special spark that makes you uniquely you. And if you haven't done so already, I invite you to come to a comfortable seated position with both feet planted firmly on the ground. And if it feels comfortable, you may close your eyes. And now I invite you to focus your awareness on your breath, breathing in and breathing out at a pace that feels comfortable to you. And with each inhale, imagine breathing in clarity and contentment. And with each exhale, imagine breathing out any tension or stress. We'll just stay here for a few moments, breathing in and breathing out, relaxing into our inner selves. And as you're breathing, I invite you to focus your attention even deeper. What is the voice of your higher self bringing into awareness in this moment? What are the desires of your heart? What is it that brings you joy? I invite you to bring to mind the people, places, situations, past or present, that have been your sources of comfort, peace, and clarity. Allow yourself to settle into the warmth and deliciousness that these gifts have brought into your life. I invite you to spend a few moments reflecting on the ways that your life has shifted because of their presence, giving gratitude for their special place in your life. Thankful that each conversation, each experience, each new adventure has shaped the person that you are and is molding the person that you are becoming. Breathing in and breathing out. And now I invite you to reflect on the gifts that your presence has offered the world. If we understand the workings of the universe, we know that we must become the gift that we want to receive. What is that special spark that you alone bring into the world? Giving gratitude for the gift of this wild and precious life. Taking comfort in hearing the words of the Creator that you are dearly beloved, and in you, I am well pleased. As we rest in this moment, rejoice in knowing that you are enough. Breathing in and breathing out, feeling perfectly calm, perfectly at peace, and feeling perfectly pleased with ourselves. Breathing in and breathing out. And now I'd like you to bring your awareness back into your body. You can start to wiggle your toes or move your fingers. And when you're ready, you may open your eyes. So when we think about creating a culture of wellness, wellness is achievable when you have a plan. So you'll have access to two handouts. So one is a SMART wellness assessment, and that is a starting point that gives you an idea about areas that are going well, as well as areas that may need additional support. And you'll also have access to a journal template. That's a good way to track how things are going as you implement your wellness strategy. So we're going to transition into Q&A. And as we transition, my question for you is, what is one step that you intend to take to help create a culture of wellness in your own life? And I want you to write that down in your journal. And as we move into Q&A, I'd like to share a few rarely seen photos of Dr. King and Mrs. King in relaxation mode. So even freedom fighters deserve a bit of rest and relaxation. So when we end our time together today, I encourage you to take this time to embrace being.
Well, thank you, Dr. Peoples, for that wonderful presentation. As you mentioned, we're now going to take some time to respond to questions. So audience members, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A function. So if you just look on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. You can click and type your question, and we will try to get to all of them in our time today. But I wanted to one, say thank you for sharing those pictures of Dr. King in rest and just enjoying himself, because you're right, we often see pictures of the speeches and the marches, and that's the version of Dr. King. That's everything that makes up who he was. But he was this whole person, just like you and I, who needed to take care of himself so that he could do the work that he did. One thing I would like to ask you before we get to a couple of the audience questions. So most of the folks today are students. They're 18 to 22 years old. And so they have these unique challenges of being in college on a residential campus. And so I'm wondering if you could share some tips or things that your clients have found helpful to implement some of the changes needed to improve their wellness.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to really set yourself up for success. So, with the SMART Wellness acronym, it's really intended to simplify that, process of creating a lifestyle that supports wellness. But even that can feel overwhelming. So, the goal isn't to go out and implement every single part of the acronym, starting tomorrow, but really identifying what are your non-negotiables. So what is one area that you really want to focus on as you begin that journey? So for me, it's sleep. So if I don't get enough sleep at night, I am not a pleasant person to be around. Whereas for other people, it might be physical activity. So some people really have to move their bodies to feel their best. Some people have to meditate every day. So really finding what is that one thing that you can start with. And then over time, you can always add in more of those other factors as you are building that lifestyle that supports wellness.
Thank you. And totally agree. It's you've got to take things one step at a time and make it manageable. Mm-hmm. So I have a question from an audience member here, and I'm going to do my best to capture it. But I actually think your picture from Google of the fit bodies and mostly white and muscular was a good example of this. But so to what extent does the normalization of whiteness, or our cultural normalization of whiteness, affect the healing process for BIPOC communities who might be suffering from generational trauma?
So definitely, there is a conscious and an unconscious impact. So I think that's where the R in the acronym really comes into play. So really recognizing who you are and what it is that you value, so that you don't get sort of confused or co-opted by external factors that try to tell you who to be. So I think really having that conscientious awareness about history and culture and some of the ways that society is set up to make people feel less than. And I think once you do recognize that, then it does become a bit easier to challenge it when it does come up internally. So that self-reflection really is a very important aspect of healing as you are going through that journey. Getting support, having community is also really important as part of that journey. When we think about goal setting, people who have an accountability partner are much more likely to reach their goals than people who try to operate in isolation. So when we think about that core American value of rugged individualism, that's something that you've got to question, is that something that fits for you? So for me, it is important to really seek out those safe spaces and to have that community as I am really working to heal things like generational trauma and racialized trauma as well.
I have another question from the audience here. You brought up the term toxic positivity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the use of social media is the main contribution towards that? And if so, how can we recover from that mindset?
So I think social media is definitely partially to blame, but I also think that organizations, and you guys aren't kind of out in the working world just yet, but when you do get into corporate America, there is this idea around burnout. So this entire industry built up around combating burnout, and generally that does come from a frame of individual resilience. So you combat burnout by doing more meditation or drinking green tea smoothies, but there isn't much analysis about how does the structure of the organization directly contribute to feeling burned out. So it may not be that you're not meditating enough. It may be that an 80-hour work week expectation isn't a realistic one. So I think that both definitely play a factor.
Yeah, and I definitely I don't want to speak out of turn, but my guess is that there's students on the Zoom today who could definitely sort of empathize with that burnout feeling, particularly our junior and senior students who are super involved, clubs and leaderships and student senate, et cetera. There's just a lot going on. I have another question here. This person was really moved by the concept that you mentioned that our day actually begins the night before, and was just curious if you had any advice that you would give in terms of students for how they might start their day, or their 2 to 3 helpful practices.
So breathing can be a really good practice. So there's something called square belly breathing, and that's essentially breathing in for a count of 5, holding for a count of 7, and exhaling for a count of 9. So doing a series of those 5, 7, 9 breaths before going to bed is a way to kind of calm down the sympathetic nervous system. So kind of the key to relaxation, or one of the keys to relaxation with breath, is that you want your exhale to be a bit longer than your inhale. So when we inhale, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so that fight or flight part of our nervous system. Whereas when we exhale, we're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, so that rest and digest part of our nervous system. So doing that breath work can be a way to kind of get centered before bedtime. Doing things like journaling can also be helpful. For people who have an active mind, I often recommend keeping a small notepad next to your bed. And the reason for that is sometimes people wake up in the middle of the night and they're just sort of ruminating about, what am I going to do tomorrow? I've got so much, to do. And sometimes just the physical act of writing it down gets it out of your head. So you're able to let it go at least long enough to be able to go to sleep that night. So.
Yeah, I can definitely relate as someone whose mind runs every evening. So this question, how do we differentiate, or do we differentiate self-care between BIPOC and non-BIPOC students?
So at least when we think about self-care, there are some things that are universal. So if we think about that SMART acronym, I think everyone could benefit regardless of racial orientation or racial identity. But within that acronym, I think it is also important to really do that reflection in terms of kind of dominant cultural norms. So in thinking about sleep, for example, rather than simply focusing on, okay, I need to get X number of hours of sleep at night, what is it that makes it more difficult for me to be able to get sleep? So have I internalized any self-talk that, it's lazy to take care of myself? Have I internalized self-talk that, running on less sleep makes me a stronger person. So those are the sorts of things to be aware of, or even in thinking about movement, what sorts of images about physical health have I internalized that may make it more difficult for me to feel comfortable going to a gym or going to a yoga class where everyone has a certain body type and is super flexible and doing crazy poses. So really understanding where some of that resistance may play a role so that you can navigate around them. So maybe it's finding POC gyms or workout partners, or finding ways that you can really incorporate that movement into your life in a way that feels good rather than in a way that makes you feel less than.
And just a reminder to the audience, if you have a question, you can throw it in the Q&A. It's on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to make sure that we get to all of them. I have another question here, and you had mentioned about I think you had specifically mentioned Black women aging a little bit faster. Could you talk maybe just a little bit more about that?
So that was research by a woman named Arlene Gibronymous, and she studied telomere lengths. So telomeres pretty much are sort of caps on the end of our DNA. So longer telomere lengths are associated with longevity. So the longer the telomere, the longer the life of the cell. So as that telomere length shortens, then the longevity decreases. So Black women had shorter telomere lengths in comparison to white women that she studied. And a lot of that was thought to be the direct result of disproportionate amounts of toxic stress. So toxic stress being stress above and beyond the normal and expected stress that we experience kind of as humans on a day-to-day basis.
I think some of that, it really brings home the importance of wellness, because in some ways, in a lot of ways, we really are talking life and death matters for some of us. It's not simply, do I have a bad day or a good day? This is directly related to our longevity.
Exactly.
I have another question from the audience. I think this one is kind of broad. So what are some ways that we can develop a balance in the physical and mental health care? Getting this whole thing, yes. What are some ways we can develop a balance in physical and mental health care while combating the rigor of our daily schedules?
Yeah, and that, balance is kind of a loaded word, because sometimes we really can't have balance if we are taking care of ourselves. So by that, I mean, it is important to really identify where your boundaries are in terms of what you are going to do to care for yourself. So most people wouldn't say, you know what, I don't have time to go to work today. I think I'm just gonna, hang out at home. Whereas most of us will say, I don't have time to work out today, or I don't have time to cook a healthy meal. But we have to prioritize things that are going to make us well, as much as we are going to prioritize things that are going to make us money. So it is important to really, do that, radical self-assessment, so that, you may have to reorder some of your priorities if you are going to be able to be well, because sometimes there may be some things that you need to give up in order to make that happen.
And I appreciate the way that you answered that, because it's real. I mean, sometimes it's a tough choice to make on what we choose to keep on our plate and what we choose to set aside. And especially, as you mentioned, if we've internalized some of those feelings of, if I'm not being productive, then I'm a failure, or I'm lazy, or weak. I have another question here from the audience. So I appreciate being given the proper articulation of weathering, which describes the constant toxic stress we face as people of color. In reference to being weathered while navigating white spaces or predominantly white spaces, what are some practical ways we can work to eliminate internalizing the feeling of isolation amongst our white peers?
I think one important thing to do is to seek community. So a lot of organizations do have affinity groups. So if you do have an affinity group available to you, being able to have that interaction with other people who share similar challenges can be a really helpful way, not only to be supported, but also to understand, ways to be able to navigate within that organization. So people may have, access to information that you may not get in other settings. And if you don't have access to that sort of group within your organization, then seeking it out in community is important. It's also important to really seek out sponsors in addition to mentors. So we hear a lot about mentorship, and mentors provide you with guidance or information, but a sponsor is someone who's actually going to open doors. So they may make key introductions, they may advocate for you for certain positions. So being able to find people who can really serve that role of sponsor is especially important for people of color, because we don't often have that, whereas non-people of color tend to have sponsorship by default, because we tend to gravitate toward people that we have a shared identity with. So that's just the unfortunate reality of navigating through certain spaces. It's also important to really identify your own personal sources of power. So that may be an author that you really resonate with, or it might be a podcast that you listen to, or it might be a sermon, so a church that you virtually attend, whatever it is that really speaks toward hope, inspiration, and empowerment. So our subconscious minds are really interesting in that our subconscious will believe whatever you tell it as long as you repeat it often enough. So if you are in environments that are reinforcing, you being less than, or feeling, that, you're not worthy, or having this, imposter syndrome feelings, it's important to offset that with environments, people, situations that are going to, reinforce how amazing you are, so that you don't start to believe or internalize messages otherwise.
Yeah, and I think in our setting at St. Ben's and St. John's, that could look like the cultural clubs that we have as a source of strength and creating spaces where we can get away from some of those negative the negative things that are put onto us. So that is that a good example, perhaps?
Oh, definitely. Mm-hmm. And it's also important to really know that kind of your existence alone is your permission for joy and peace and happiness. So it's not something that has to be earned or deserved. So a lot of times people think, well, if I can only make X amount of money, I'll be happy. If I can only meet the right person, then I'll be happy. So really recognizing that you deserve those things just by virtue of being a human living and breathing on the planet, rather than the other way around.
I'm really, really glad you said that. I remember that phrase from another conversation that we had. I'm glad that the folks in attendance today were able to hear it. I have one final question, and it's just related to something that you mentioned going back to sleep, but I think came up in other themes, which was that to get in the habit of going to sleep at a similar time. And it seemed like what you were talking about is a routine. And can you talk about the value, or if there is value, to having routines?
Mm-hmm. So routine can help solidify behaviors. So, having, repeating a routine, I think it's 21 days to build a habit. So it becomes easier to sustain when you do have a routine. But in terms of sleep particularly, it's important because it helps our internal clock stay regulated. So we have this idea of a circadian rhythm. And when we think about stress, I think people tend to think about stress in terms of psychological stress. So that's just one way that the body experiences stress. But anything that throws off your homeostasis. So that sense of balance is experienced as stress by the body. So disrupted sleep is interpreted as a stressor. Blood sugar imbalances is interpreted as a stressor. Inflammation is interpreted as a stressor. So it's important that all of those areas are in good balance and good alignment, so that we can be metabolically healthy. So when we are under more stress, then we're more likely to have things like high blood pressure and diabetes and obesity, et cetera. So.
Well, thank you. And once again, I'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Reba Peoples, for a wonderful presentation. We'll be sending out those smart wellness tools that she mentioned to folks who are registered later today. I have no doubt that each one of us can take lessons, or at least a lesson learned from today, and incorporate them into your lives as we continue to fight for justice at home and abroad. And it's important when we want to take care of others, we also have to take care of ourselves. As a reminder, we have additional MLK Week events happening tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. with a presentation from Dr. Kurt Hollander on W.E.B. Du Bois and the connections between the German intellectual tradition and the U.S. civil rights movement. So that's tomorrow at 11:30 a.m., a virtual presentation open to all faculty, staff, students, and community members. And then on Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m. is our keynote speaker, Dr. Chris Lehmann, who is the author of the award-winning book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. Just a reminder, these events are virtual, free, and open to the public. I hope to see you there. Lastly, thank you again, Dr. Peoples, and thank you to the audience for joining us, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.